What I'm going to talk about today, I always have to give a little bit of a nod and a scrape to the fact that this is part of a ARC discovery project called Building an Indian Ocean Region. A little bit more about myself, which is relevant to the subject that Elspeth may not have mentioned. I was the major institution, if you like, regional institution for the Indian Ocean is the Indian Ocean Rim Association, based in Mauritius. Don't know if anyone in Darwin has heard about it. A lot of people in Adelaide and Perth haven't, even though Perth's on the Indian Ocean. When Australia became chair of that organisation under Julie Bishop about 4 years ago, I took on the chair of the academic role based in Mauritius, which was a fantastic opportunity to build academic networks that on many real occasions be involved in regional network building beyond purely academic pursuits. The other thing I've been doing in recent times at Curtin University has been setting up an Indian Ocean Research Centre. We still in this country haven't got one yet. We've got the science, but we haven't got the social science or humanities part of that equation. And it's still very difficult trying to convince Australians that we do, in large part, live on the Indian Ocean as much as we live on the Pacific. My old joke with that Wayne will remember with Adelaide has a real chip on its shoulder about being at the wrong end of the Murray River system. And what I try and convince local politicians and practitioners in Adelaide is that Adelaide is actually the meeting place, the confluence of two geoeconomic systems, the Indian and Pacific, and to see it outside in thinking is much more creative and positive, a meeting place for two great oceans rather than the wrong end of the Murray. So why am I interested in different types of this notion of the rise of the Indo-Pacific? What I'm going to do is talk about 4 different types of regionalisms that are very powerful at the moment, particularly Indian Ocean regionalisms, and then I'm going to talk about the development, the very fashionable development of this concept of the Indo-Pacific and what does it mean locally. I've already had a couple of conversations today. Colin, involved with weather for a long time, tells me that people really talk in local terms about their seas, whether it's Arafura, whether it's Beagle or the Timor Sea, the Beagle Strait, Beagle Gulf, and where these are and where they're included and whether they're connected to oceanic systems at all. I want to divide these types of regionalisms into 4 areas, which will organise what I'm going to say today. We're going to look at nation status definitions of oceanic regionalisms, a couple of sub-regional definitions, the emergence of pan-regional definitions, including the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and super-regional definitions like the Indo-Pacific, and what they actually mean in terms of impacts upon local peoples. The first thing, Colin and I had a brief yarn earlier about different map making. The Australian government definition of the Indian Ocean region is really interesting. I had a conversation with a lighthouse keeper at Point Lewin, Cape Lewin, and on that lighthouse there's a line, and it says, if you head southwards of that line, you enter into the Southern Ocean. Northwards of that line is the Indian Ocean. Well, interestingly enough, it's only the Australian and British maps that draw that line, and Elspeth suggested to me, maybe that's where they built the lighthouse, so they sort of thought they better make use of it, the same Cape Don, which is a good story. Most global maps have the Southern Ocean appearing at 60 degrees latitude, but the Aussie maps and the Brit maps use that line. Does anyone know why? One of the key reasons is because of the Antarctic claim. And Australia claims Antarctica in a triangle down at the pole, and therefore lays claim as that being separate to the Indian Ocean. Most other maps have it going to, including Bass Strait, and of course Adelaide becomes part of the Indo-Pacific there. Most global maps include Darwin in the eastern Indian Ocean. And the Arafura Sea is at the tip of the western Pacific. So you're right bang, whiz bang in the middle here of this construction of Indo-Pacific, though I'm not too sure whether, but does anyone locally use the concept of Indo-Pacific? No? I went down and saw Indo-Pacific Marine yesterday and took a little picture of that for my collection about people using that terminology. We'll see why the Indo-Pacific has emerged so forcefully in a minute. Most global maps include Africa, maritime Africa, in their constructions of what the Indian Ocean is, and even in the construction of the Indo-Pacific. We'll talk about that. This particular area of the Indian Ocean contributes to about 40 to 45% of the Earth's people. It's an ocean which includes some of the poorest people on the planet. It's also an ocean which celebrates remarkable diversity in political, religious, cultural terms. The Indian definition of the Indo-Pacific is very different, or of the Indian Ocean rather is very different. India constructs the idea of a natural maritime world, and it goes back to the geopolitics of Panikar, his steel ring in 1945, which really is an Indian version of the Monroe Doctrine in the United States. That there's a natural space beyond India, which is Indian, and a triangle, and Panikar wrote in 45, whoever controls the Indian Ocean has India at its mercy. So it was seen in a strategic way, but also as a cultural way. Just recently, Indonesia took chair of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and I've been working very closely with the Indonesian government in a special edition that the Indonesians wanted to publish of the Journal of the Indian Ocean Region, which I'll talk about later on. But they wanted to talk about cultural intersections. They wanted to talk about the stories that each country had which proved some kind of essential relationship with the sea. So we're talking about an increased geopolitics of the sea, importance of the sea or oceans. And so many of these claims, particular nation states, are claiming some kind of natural or essential relationship with the sea or an ocean. Interestingly enough, many Indian scholars argued the case, particularly within Hinduism, that to cross the sea was to lose one's religion. So for a long time, India did not engage with itself as a maritime state. This is changing dramatically in recent times, and histories are being revisited and rewritten and revised. So I'm very interested in these cultural intersections. We've seen it with China and the South China Sea. This argument that the South China Sea was always Chinese. We see Indonesia have been arguing for themselves now as a maritime nation. So we're seeing different nation states articulating ocean spaces in very different ways to defend and to promote their prominent role in that region. That's fairly obvious. The sub-regional constructs are quite interesting. The first one I'm going to pick on is the Francophone construct. This is the Indian Ocean Commission, and it only includes 5 countries, which I've listed up there. They're all islands, they're all French or French territories. It's really important, I think, to understand that within the Indian Ocean, the French are still the biggest landholders. 2017, the French still own more land-based territory in the Indian Ocean than anyone else. So the French are huge players in the Indian Ocean. It's obviously based on the French language and promoting a solidarity and sustainable development amongst those islands. We recently did an edition, the edition which has just come back out in June, of the Journal of the Indian Ocean Region, which is a Routledge publication, which I've put some flyers at the front. I'm here to promote as chief editor. It's very difficult and sometimes questionable to start a new journal, but I would argue it's a critical time for Australia and the rest of the world to engage, to provide a voice for the people within the Indian Ocean, but also to allow people outside the Indian Ocean to hear it and to contribute to it. The other main pan-regional, at this stage I'm talking about the Indian Ocean, did I go past that? The sub-regional rather, a sub-regional construction is this one that came out of DFAT, Foreign Affairs and Trade here in Australia. The Australian government worries on occasions, and I can say this as the DFAT focal point for the Indian Ocean region, that constructing the Indian Ocean as far as Africa is strategic overreach. We just can't do it, whether it relates in naval terms or market terms. So the Australian government, on occasions, and often within various bureaucratic agencies, you have different opinions, of course. Therefore, to talk in terms of the voice and dominant perceptions of nation-states is often fraught with difficulties. But this is one such vision, a sub-regional construct, come out of the work of Bateman and Bergen, based in a think tank which currently informs a lot of the Australian government's foreign policies. Talks about a sub-region which includes the Bay of Bengal and South China Sea. In this relationship, we see India, Australia, Indonesia, with Japan prioritised. So this is largely based on strategic overreach, reducing the Indian Ocean region as far west as the Bay of Bengal. The Australian government has been pursuing that on occasions. What happened, of course, when we've had a couple of powerful ministers now, Geordie Bishop from Perth, or representing an electorate in Perth, the electorate of WA, as now as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, the emergence of these pan-regional constructions of the Indian Ocean region. So how would you define who was in and who was out? Well, the first thing you could say, and I've been to many conferences and many government and corporate and NGO collectors where people talk about, you know, wherever the water of the Indian Ocean touches the toes of the people. Well, that's a literal construction, looking at the primacy of the sea. Yet, of course, many states in Africa that aren't right on the Indian Ocean trade predominantly through the Indian Ocean. The political epicentre is the Indian Ocean. So do we also include the non-littoral nations? And I just compiled a bit of a list here of landlocked states, some of the rim states, etc., to talk about the Indian Ocean region. How do we construct it as a pan-region? The dominant institutional depiction of a region, regions exist. They're constructed in very different ways. And institutions impose a view on them from one particular angle. The Indian Ocean Rim Association, it used to be a terrible acronym called EORAC. When Geordie Bishop came in, she changed that to make it a little bit easier for everyone. Began in 1997, it's been around 20 years, just had its 20th anniversary, and I think it's probably one of the least visible regional associations that Australia's engaged with. We've got ASEAN, APEC, etc. EORA, most Australians wouldn't know what EORA was. More people in WA perhaps. There are member states. Recently Somalia was included. It is a one vote out organisation, so you must have full support of all member states. The glaring omissions compared to the previous table that I gave you include Pakistan, for example. Because it is a veto organisation, India would never admit Pakistan. A lot of the Muslim countries within the organisation are constantly advocating the inclusion of Pakistan. And indeed Indonesia, who's now chair of the organisation, about to hand over to South Africa in October, advocates the inclusion of Pakistan. The dialogue partners are really interesting, and these have exploded in recent times. Traditionally, it was Egypt, France, Japan, and the United Kingdom. In the last 3 years, China came on board, and through the entire budget of every other country in the organisation, matched it all and put it on the table and said we're in. As soon as China came in, the US decided to move away in small part from its non-regional association membership role, which allows them open access to anywhere, and they decided they better see what was going on in the room. And Germany's just come in last year on the basis of huge fishing interests in the Indian Ocean region, as well as other things. The Indian Ocean Research Group is an observer organisation of which I'm the Vice Chair. We managed to get observer status some time ago, and therefore this new journal with Routledge that we've launched is associated with the aura. How to run a journal associated with a regional association which operates on veto? How do you maintain academic independence and rigour? Is a constant daily test, but that was part of the way we drew up the particular challenge to remain neutral and outside of the veto politics of the organisation. All right, that's pretty obvious. I've looked at some national constructions of the Indian Ocean region. I've looked at attempts to build a neighbourhood, to talk about how do we build a pan-regional organisation, an Indian Ocean region. Do we include littoral states, non-littoral states? I've looked at the way the French define it. I've looked at the way EORA's define it. EORA's a predominantly Anglophone organisation. Although it's based in Mauritius, there is a real contestation of power between the French and the British here. Even though it's based in Mauritius, and also the Indians are very, very much engaged in who runs EORA. But what I want to talk now is over the past 5, 6, 7 years is this strong emergence of a super-regional construction, what we call Indo-Pacific regionalism. Indo-Pacific regionalism, of course, includes the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. But confusingly enough, this whole construction of ocean space is actually rooted in how we've constructed the Mediterranean and the Atlantic in the past. But I won't get into that. That's another paper. We had a symposium on Friday at UWA on the emergence and power of this Indo-Pacific construction. I want to talk a little bit about the origins of the Indo-Pacific construction, but also some of the ways in which different countries in the region are using this construction instead of an Indian Ocean regionalism, instead of a Pacific regionalism. First and foremost, this was hotly pursued by Hillary Clinton under the previous Democratic administration. This idea that somehow there was a movement away, a pivot away from the Middle East, whether that's happened at all, but that was the argument, and that this was a regional architecture in the Asia-Pacific, and that Australia was playing a central role. Australia, if you look at the Indo-Pacific maps that I'll show in a minute, instead of Australia being a bit like at the end of the Murray River, Australia's now right whack bang in the middle of global geopolitics. And the Australian government, of all countries, is articulating this case. In the last white paper, it was mentioned 67 times, this Indo-Pacific construction. Most Australians don't know what it is, haven't even discussed it over a barbecue anywhere. But it is now a dominant construction within most foreign affairs initiatives within the Australian government. So Australia's counsel and commitment have been indispensable. The origins of the Indo-Pacific are really interesting, and at the moment I'm writing a book with an Indian colleague of mine and another fellow from Curtin, Derek Rumley, Sanjay Chaturvedi from Punjab University in India, and Derek Rumley in Curtin. And what we're looking at is some of the original usages of the Indo-Pacific and see whether these are revisiting. Are some of these traits of how the Indo-Pacific was originally constructed re-emerging under this current rhetoric, this current narrative? Some of the earliest references we found was under Karl Haushofer, the Nazi geopolitician back in the 20s. And Haushofer argued whoever made an alliance with that part of the Indo-Pacific area with its rich resources could rule the rest of the world. We also saw, associated with Haushofer, some of his disciples, Frederick Ratzel, and also Alan Semple, who was a key geopolitics spokesperson and scholar in the United States in the early years of the 20th century. Indeed, the Mackinder pivot, the pivot away from the Middle East, was the language of Alan Semple and the language of those US geopoliticians, built on them being PhD students of Frederick Ratzel, who was a disciple of Haushofer. It's quite interesting to see the American language and relate to some of the early German narratives. I'm not saying that the American narratives are essentially Nazi. What I'm saying is there are elements of that rhetoric, elements of that narrative which we need to explore the historical roots to make a better understanding of the current usage. What was that current idea back in the 30s of the Indo-Pacific? Well, it related to this thing called Lebensraum, which was a little bit like the Panacard steel ring out of India. A little bit like the Monroe Doctrine, this idea that countries had natural and essential borders, And the use of biological analogies isn't surprising when we're talking about Nazi constructions of geopolitics or Nazi constructions of society. These ideas were that states were organisms and that they expanded and retracted in competition with neighbouring organisms for space, occupying a natural living space. And indeed, that essentialist language, that the sea somehow was more essential, that oceans were somehow more essential than the land, that there was a purity attached to sea space is quite fascinating. And if you read those early tomes about Lebensraum, you'll see this essentialist. The nature of nature is essential. And of course, these same ideas were used to decide who would live and who would die. The pan-regions of the 30s cut the world up normally into 3 regions, and the Indo-Pacific was one of them, and sometimes 4. In all of these regions, we saw a core industrial unit, and a periphery which supplied raw materials. In the Indo-Pacific, we saw Japan as being handed, if you like, or the globe being divided into different regions, and Japan's region was referred to as the Indo-Pacific. Germany, in some depictions, controlled Africa and Europe, and the Americas at that stage were outside of control. So the Indo-Pacific really entered into the rhetoric of geopolitics during this period, and Japan was seen as having a natural space which, of course, enabled and demanded it to move to Australia, to move to India, etc. See, the natural space ends at the west of India in that construction of the Indo-Pacific. Well, let's then get away from World War II and let's look at how the Indo-Pacific has re-emerged. In this book for Oxford University Press that I'm writing, as I mentioned before, is that we're not calling it we're calling it the rise and return of the Indo-Pacific. Now, here, the metaphors of servicing core are more about containment, pivot points, and counterbalance. And indeed, it's impossible to talk about the current construction of Indo-Pacific without talking about China. In some ways, the Indo-Pacific can be understood as a US reaction to the growth of China, and the language of containment is right through the literature, not just containment. The other key factors in the rise of the Indo-Pacific has been the rise of India as well. We cannot construct the Indo-Pacific without a discussion of India, and without a construction of the contested space between India and China. Whether you want to call it the South China Sea, whether it's the Straits of Malacca or whatever, or whether it's in a whole range of economies across what we now used to refer to as the Indo-Pacific region. But also, as I mentioned before, it's also about the United States, a contestation of power within the region. In this particular book, we're looking at a whole range of nation states and the way that they're using the Indo-Pacific. Indonesia is quite fascinating. Indonesia came right on board with the language of the Indo-Pacific when it first took over the chair of IORA 2 years ago. But what it found itself uncomfortably wedged between China, Australia and the United States just in the last 6 months or so. So they've jettisoned the language of the Indo-Pacific. They're now calling it Pakindo, reversing it, and only including a couple of core states around Indonesia. So that's the other thing. Not only are we seeing different notions and narratives within governments, I'm talking very terse generalities here, but also over time these constructions change rapidly. The other key one is the relationship between these countries based on an alliance between around the United States, India, Australia, Japan, those 4 pillars, and it was Indonesia, but Indonesia has quite recently started backpedaling, as I mentioned, on that coalition building around the Indo-Pacific. Now, this the current construction in Indo-Pacific is very similar to the geographical parameters in a dominant conservative depiction, that Africa is separated to match US command structures. So what we see in this construction of the Indo-Pacific is very similar. This is the US PACCOM, AfricaCom over on the left, and you'll see really that map is very closely related. The Indo-Pacific, which doesn't actually touch the United States in most depictions of the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific ends, never touching the shores of the United States. I've never seen a construction of US that touches the United States, but you'll see that this is very similar in terms of Asia and Australia to Indo-Pacific as defined in the Second World War, with the Japanese drawing the boundary at the west part of India, and it matches the command, the structure of command within military forces. So the United States sees a division between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans and has been very uncomfortable traditionally with Indo-Pacific. But that's all changed under Obama. Under the Obama administration, where the Trump administration is at the moment, it's still a little bit unclear. But this is a comment from Barry Bazan, a very good critical geopolitical scholar, who writes that it is so vast that it sometimes doesn't mean anything at all. It fits in with a long-standing, very clever anti-regional diplomatic tactic of the United States. By defining itself as part of various super regions, the US both legitimises its intrusions into them and gives itself leverage against the formation of regional groups that excludes it. And that would be the same approach that the United States has had in Antarctica, for example, whereby it does not recognise territory of any other nation state, but that enables it to move freely through the borders and boundaries of those territories. But also, we've seen, apart from the Australian defence initiatives and within DFAT, this emergence of the Indo-Pacific, we've now seen the Indo-Pacific really emerge strongly both in defence and foreign affairs official grey documentation out of the United States. This is a quotation from a working admiral in the United States. And I like it because, again, it talks about the Indo-Pacific as something which is a continuum of security requirements, not broken down by historical perspectives on different oceans. Forget about those different stories of Indonesia or India articulating, or Germany or Australia articulating some kind of essential relationship to ocean space. Rather, the Indo-Pacific is just a continuum. Nothing to do with history. It's year zero. What we're really on about is ships and airplanes travelling across the Indian Ocean. We're on about sea lanes of security, sea lanes of communication. And we'll protect those sea lanes regardless of whether they cross national territories or not. We saw it most clearly recently in the South China Sea, drive-by or sail-by, or whatever you want to call it. And these are critical for trade and the flow of energy resources. So we've now seen this vehement taking on of the language of the Indo-Pacific, which was really championed by the Australian government. And the US have come on board and working with it, but their definition of the Indo-Pacific is completely different. The Americans see it as a super region, as if you like, a non-region at the same time, to allow it to move freely through that space. Whereas the Australian government, this is a definition that the Centre we set up at Adelaide Uni gave to the Australian government, which the Australian government uses. What we're trying to do within this particular construction of an Indian Ocean is not turn it into a new Cold War scenario, but rather this Indo-Pacific vision includes China. It includes Africa. No Indo-Pacific map includes California. The United States does not want to be included in a regional construction of Indo-Pacific because it allows it, as I said, to pass through it as non-territory. I do want to talk about the Western Indian Ocean and why I think to include Africa is critical in a lot of these things. And this is contrary to Australian government attempts. I understand that budgets are critical in determining what can and cannot be done at universities as well as the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade or whatever, but for me to understand and to work. Just last 18 months ago, we set up a conference, a symposium in Kenya to look at maritime Africa, to understand that Japan is investing many of its resources, using an Indian face in Africa at the moment, to imagine by 2050, by conservative estimates, the projections, Africa will be as big as India and China combined, and then to ignore it. And sorry, that's too much. We can't deal with Africa, it's too hard. I'm sorry. That's not good enough. So in my arguments about the Indo-Pacific, in my arguments about the Indian Ocean region, it must include maritime Africa, at least from South Africa up to the Gulf. The vast majority, the Indian Ocean will grow from being 40% of the planet to 65% of the planet in the next 20 or 30 years. It must include a discussion of Africa. How would I conclude? I conclude that one size does not fit all in policy response terms, that I understand the use of the super region, the Indo-Pacific, but I would argue for a far more rooted concept of Indo-Pacific, one which is actually based in the concept of region. Region is, on the one hand, a response to undifferentiated, non-differentiated globalisation, and it's a result of globalisation. I like the idea of region. I like the idea, the Indian Ocean Rim Association is fraught with difficulties. But you know what? It makes the European Union look very in its representation. The European Union is a Christian organisation. The Indo-Pacific, the Indian Ocean crosses all global religions on this planet and celebrates that diversity. Yes, it's very difficult to make decisions. Of course it is. But you're also building bridges. I'm doing the liberal cooperative argument here, but for me, is there are many weaknesses in these regional associations, but to sit down at that table, when we're talking about in an Australian context, a society that does not really sit down at the table of too many nations west of Perth. It's a very, very promising scenario as far as I'm concerned. So I suppose I articulated in this particular paper we did a collection on Africa and the Indian Ocean region. I was promoting this concept of genuine regionalism rather than this non-territory, this non-region that we refer to as the Indo-Pacific. Final thing I wanted to say, I suppose I've just got a couple of brochures out there. I did want to promote the journal. It is a very challenging time. For me, there was no journal of the Indian Ocean region. As academics, having to get required points to go and study leave, let alone promotion, or to justify your pay packet for another year. We're told, and telling younger staff all the time, oh, make sure you publish in those old established journals, A+ journals, etc. But when you're building a journal from scratch, you've got no ranking. For me, it came about because it was critical to have a journal that was focused on this region, even within Routledge. Routledge had their own maps of the world. They had their own regions, at the moment of Africa and Asia, and they're separated. And I went and I said, no, hold on. We've got to build a map that's integrating Africa with Asia and the rest of the world. You can't have the divide based on US naval maritime practices. The world must include the Indian Ocean, not just as a non-space between Africa and East Asia, Southeast Asia. So that was a huge part of the driver of this new journal, was to develop this map in conceptual terms, to build an Indian Ocean region, to try and build links between the people within that region, to try and promote academic, scholarly communities, to try and integrate that region to understand its people within it. Thanks so much for listening to that diatribe today, and again thanking the Northern Institute for kindly inviting me to speak. Questions or comments? Oh, thanks.
Yeah, no, we've got about 20 minutes, so...
Yeah.
Tim, the last person I heard refer to the EU as a Christian organisation. Turkish consulate.
Someone in Turkey, yeah.
The Turkish consulate
Yeah.
in Hong Kong. And I thought that was really interesting because most Europeans wouldn't think that. And as someone who for years now has been working on religion and its geopolitical, anthropological dynamics, I said, what struck me as interesting about the paper, I kept thinking all the way through this, is that is this an issue primarily for strategic issues, or is it primarily resources plus trade? Now, of course, you could say, well, they all really go together. But that does, I think that question, though, becomes more important if you don't have the liberal view that you've put up. If you see, if everyone, you know, the liberal view, when everything's good and everyone's getting on, great.
Yeah.
But what about when not?
Yeah.
And given the geopolitical circumstances in the Middle East, also affecting Africa, of course, also troubles in India, how does that?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. Look, for me, and we did a specialist on geopolitics and geoeconomics and the way in which they're intertwined. I think the super region of the United States, the Indo-Pacific, is very much a fantastic example of how the two are intertwined. It reminds me of the old days. The metaphor that I kind of use is the old days of the military riding along the wagons in the Wild West to protect that trade route. And so, and you know, I see the epitome of this, and Elspeth is working on biopolitics of your training. In the past, whether you are working on it now, through Nick Dillon's kind of construction of geopolitics, would be that you know, this it's indistinguishable. That force is protecting these routes much the same way as the mercantilist routes were being protected in the expansion of the United Kingdom, you know, after slavery. I mean, it's protect those routes, see those routes, deny ownership or historical associations. They're not interesting. All we're here to do is business, and that's the same argument that the Chinese government is using through one belt, one road, Port of Darwin and elsewhere, and it's just business. You know, excuse me if it's like watching a remake of Don Corleone's talks in The Godfather. But that's both sides. In fact, you know, one of the reasons I'm here speaking at the Law Institute tomorrow is to promote a conference in Darwin on one belt, one road. But so, you know, I'm working closely with Chinese depictions of Indo-Pacific. The Chinese government, interestingly, initially rejected the concept of Indo-Pacific, felt that it was a construction of containment against them, and have now decided to come on board and use it for included for their own purposes, which has been quite interesting. So my answer to you, I'm sorry, I'm going to conflate the two. I think it's very much an example of geoeconomics and geostrategy together. I'm not saying, I'm articulating the liberal framework, the liberal argument at the end to talk about cooperation. I'm not saying that there's also not a palace system, that there's a whole arena of realist politics, and of course there is. It is about strategy. You can't have strategy without controlling resources, and vice versa. So for me, it is both. It's fiercely strategical to control resources. Speaking to a lot of Chinese scholars, Bo Gang He, who works out of Deakin, he would argue that again, this isn't about one dominant game, one dominant winner. That the West is interested in these sorts of games. So there's geostrategic games that obviously to control ports, to control pathways of trade is at the same time a strategic game. So I just agree with you, I suppose. And it's not the coward's way out to conflate the two. I just can't, I'm sorry, I can't separate them at the moment. The Indo-Pacific game is about protecting trade routes. It's about the Malacca Straits. It's about the South China Sea.
I think that's all true. I just think it's geopolitically, things are positioned very differently if you're economically in, and if you're not. If you're struggling and you want territorial expansion because you absolutely desperately need it, then I think it's a...
You're right, and I think it's really interesting looking at these stories. This conference I was speaking in Indonesia, held by Foreign Affairs in Indonesia at Jakarta last year. It was interesting, the middle powers, the aspiring middle powers, like, you know, India is a middle power, genuine middle power, you know, Indonesia, Malaysia, that they were the ones telling the essential stories to root them to this place, to justify their own ends. And India is a wonderful example. Project Masam in India is about building song lines across the Indian Ocean region that it's going to use under the United Nations Heritage Convention to argue that it has an essential relationship, and using that convention to stop other countries from moving into that space. That's not the United States now. They can't argue that essential relationship. So I agree with you that the middle powers have a very different kind of game here about essential cultural associations with the space, whereas outside powers deny or not interested in those stories.
So what's Australia's attitude to this geoeconomics?
Australia's attitude is really interesting, and you know, I as I said 67 times in the last events paper, it was originally a Labor construct. There was some, like all governments, different parties articulate different lines, and when Rudd was ultimately removed, there was some fear within government that the Conservatives wouldn't run with it, but they did. And I think in part it had to do with Bishop's enthusiasm to get the rest of the nation, including the Indian Ocean, as part of their construction. So phenomenal was that. But no, they vociferously endorsed it now, and it being a key, and the US, although they were engaged in the initial writing of these stories, were a little bit concerned about it. Australia's got a very different notion of the Indo-Pacific than the US. Its notion is rooted in place. It's saying, hold on, we're here. These are our neighbours. And so it's the same badge, but again constructed very differently, like almost for very different purposes. I think on the positive side, that Australia's been able to engage in the region, in the Indian Ocean region, trying to be in a little bit more mature way. It's not just seen as the deputy sheriff on nearly every occasion. They're trying to develop its own relationships. Having said that, when the Indo-Pacific is constructed as a containment strategy, it gets worried that its greatest trading partner, China, might be a bit uneasy with it. But as I said, China's changed in recent times to become more cooperative and inclusive on that regional construction. So Australia, any global map, the one I showed you before, I mean, Australia's now at the centre of the world. Of course, the Australian government likes that construction, and is being both sides of Parliament are pushing this agenda at the moment.
There's a peculiar intersection between, I don't know, the One Belt, One Road, which I know they changed it from being the Silk Road, perhaps because it kind of made itself seem too land-based, and actually One Belt is actually quite a lot of maritime-based connections. But it seems that there might be this interesting tension between One Belt, One Road, which is primarily a land-based understanding of the world and its logistics, and then this, in these various phases, sea-based version. And I was just wondering if, if you look at ports, you get this really interesting moment where conceptually and materially those two different understandings of the world and the logistics. One is
sea, one is land.
Yeah. And they're kind of in the middle, and then how you manage that relationship would be quite interesting.
I think you're spot on. In fact, at this recent symposium at UW on Friday that I mentioned, we were talking about, I think I had a list of 12 different constructions of what Indo-Pacific was, and some of them were built from a nation-state's perspective, as I mentioned, and some of them were not this super region, non-region. One of them I threw out was Indo-Pacific as land. We construct this idea that it must be sea, it must be ocean, but I think you're right. I think that the Chinese construction has been more land-based. And yes, these are different geopolitical constructions. Whether One Belt, One Road is an example of Indo-Pacificism or whether it is different can be argued either way. But I think you're right. I think the Shanghai Corporation, which now includes places in Eurasia, this idea of moving right up into Asia now, particularly Eastern European countries. Is fascinating regional associations as well, so that they are being constructed. We're seeing this rapid emergence of alternate regional constructions at the moment. And Australia happens to be right there. And people are saying, hold on, you know, what does this one mean? Who's in it? Who's out of this one? Who's in this one? Who's out of this one? And I think in part, whether it is a pivot away from the Middle East, but there's no doubt that there's an impetus here, and that money, resources are being invested in this region. But I think that's a wonderful example. You know, I once said Indo-Pacific is a literal zone between India and the Pacific Ocean. A literal zone is normally a meeting place between land and sea. So I think you're right. I think although the Chinese are engaged in port building and maritime growth with navies, etc., I see a lot of the construction of the Chinese port as more land-based. So that's a really interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, I was interested in your comment about the Indian songline. I thought that was an Aboriginal construct.
Well, some lines, yeah, I was borrowing it from that wonderful book by South African work who wrote that at the front bar of the Exeter Hotel. Mate, did you know that? You wrote that at the front bar of the Exeter Hotel.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm feeling.
Yeah, in Adelaide. But, and he did use it as that, but it's also used in a broader sense, which is very similar to Chaplin's song lines, whereby a song is sung and, you know, with this story you find where the waterholes are or whatever. India are really engaged in building, they're including these archaeological digs, etc., in this justification. Project Masam, M-A-U-S-A-M, which is quite fascinating, to argue that, no, all that stuff about the Hinduism, you couldn't cross the sea and you lose religion, that Rabindranath Tagore wrote about, is all wrong. No, India will always engage in its maritime power within this region. And so they're building these song lines, these stories, these narratives that connect them to the natural world, the essential world, which is quite fascinating. So I use it in that sense. And on that very point, at the Indonesian conference on the cultural intersections, the development of these historical narratives, I argue, where are the Australian narratives here? Where are the Australian pre-colonial narratives here? I mean, I'd be fascinated. I'm sure this university is probably the best place to investigate that would be to understand some of those narratives of Indigenous communities, because, you know, there'll be stories of the seas and songlines of the seas.
Well, some of these already included Macassans and whatever from
the Macassans, that's right. Yeah, so that was the sense they used the songline. You're right. Yes.
I have sort of two components to this question. The first is, are there any indications from your vantage point of any shift in the American viewpoint under Trump in terms of, is it, you know, going to be a continuation of that construct, or is there going to be any sizable shifts? And then the second component is, what are your predictions over the next, 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, well, the answer to the Trump one, I don't know. I mean, my argument is that people say to me, Tim, you're that focal point, you know, how do you feel about this party or whatever? Mm-hmm. My argument is that that's not my role, that I'm working with the bureaucracy that are there, that unelected officials that are there to serve the people of Australia. Mm-hmm. And yes, of course, parties come and go, and they're very important and they're based on democratic principles and we need them. But that's my diplomatic answer away in my own country. Mm-hmm. I'd say the same. I think that in the United States, most of the people that I've been dealing with at the bureaucratic level are still there and are working on the same programs that they were working on before. Whether that remains or not, we'll see. So my guess is as good as yours on that. And I suppose that relates to predictions. Well, I've always been very wary of making predictions, particularly, as I said, we have a fairly unpredictable leader at the moment. Most people would say that. I would argue that, as I said before, with the rise, everyone talks about the rise of India and the rise of China. I think with the rise of Africa, we're increasingly see, not just in population numbers, the Indian Ocean region grow. Again, I mean, most Australians wouldn't, there'd be no school course looking at the polity or the countries. I never got taught which countries were in the Indian Ocean. I don't know any of you. And so at least this Indo-Pacific construction is forcing us to look west. I know there have been old look west policies in the past, and to engage with, I think, not just the rest of the world, but the most dynamic part of the planet. This is where the Industrial Revolution, as I always say, never finished. It simply moved its sites of production. And at the moment, obviously, China, India, but we've seen it move now to maritime Africa. The cheapest labour, many of the Japanese companies that were, we set up a symposium in Tokyo, said, please come along, you'll be setting it all up, said, we want to do beyond ASEAN towards Europe. We're moving all our head offices out of Australia, and we're moving them we're going to move to Africa, but we're going to use an Indian base. We're going to use a fantastic model of development, one that's fair, that employs local people, all this sort of stuff. But, to ignore that part of the world. So for me, prediction is Australia is in a terrific position to engage more fruitfully with its neighbours on its own terms. I think one really good example recently was in Sri Lanka, with the Buddhist uprisings in Sri Lanka. And speaking to a lot of Sri Lankan delegates, Australia took a different position. Of course, on the whole, it has to is endorsing US foreign policy. But it took its own position on those uprisings. It did not come down against them and said, we don't construct this as a major problem. That was diametrically opposed to the US position. So I'm hoping as Australia becomes a more fully fledged, knowledgeable member of its region, its regionhood, that it could be a better time for Australia in the future. So that again, it's a positive view. I think this is going to be the centre of the world. That's my prediction. And that it's not just about the Middle East, it's about the Atlantic not being so important anymore. Of course, it will continue to be a very powerful position, but the Indo-Pacific, the Indian-Pacific Oceans will become more central to global geopolitics in the future. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming.